Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's February 22nd, 2025. We're going to start today by talking about COVID. So first I want to give some background on who, I'm going to start with a clip. I want to give some background on the woman who's speaking. It's Deborah Birx. She's an American physician and diplomat who served as the White House coronavirus response coordinator under President Trump from 2020 to 2021. And she was also part of the White House Coronavirus Task Force from February 2020 to January 2021. So she was, along with Anthony Fauci, the face of the public health response to COVID beginning in early 2020. So Deborah Birx was on the Piers Morgan show this week, February 2025. Here's what she had to say.
And what we've done wrong in public health is we didn't explain that COVID vaccines were nothing like the childhood vaccines, and that the childhood vaccines, like many of the diseases, you get it once, you don't get it again. And this is getting the children to have that disease without getting the deadly consequences. That is not what the COVID vaccine was designed to do. It wasn't designed to prevent against infection. And if you look at the vaccine hesitancy rates, they've doubled since COVID. So we have to start addressing these things. We can't just ignore them.
And Deborah, let me ask you, Deborah, I mean, given that you were the face of COVID from the Trump presidency at the time, do you share, this doctor who I was with, do you share the concerns about the longer term negative impact of some of the COVID vaccines?
The messenger RNA vaccine should have been rolled out for the people that were at risk for severe disease, because that's what the vaccine was developed for. But when we say that we're following the science and the data, we need to follow the science and the data. And the science and the data said people primarily over 65 or people with significant comorbidities were at risk for severe disease. Those are the individuals that should have been immunized first. And we should have put our science behind our immunization schedule and protected those most at risk. It went into young people in hospitals before it went into our elderly and nursing homes. That is not following the science and the data. So I am all for following the science and the data, but it shouldn't just be a statement. It should be a reality.
So here we have one of the top people tasked in the United States with dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, admitting first that the COVID-19 vaccine is not actually a vaccine, at least by any reasonable definition of a vaccine. And secondly, that it shouldn't have been given to huge numbers of the people that it was given to, specifically relatively young people and healthy people. I guess it's better late than never, but I don't think it's going to do much good to the countless people who got the vaccine against their better judgment for a myriad of reasons, whether it was social pressure, fear of being ostracized, whether it was being in school and university and facing expulsion if you didn't get the vaccine, whether it was military, being in the military and being required to it, whether it was fear of the OSHA requirement that the Biden administration tried to push through, in which any business with, I think it was 30 or 40 or 50 employees, which is a lot of businesses in the United States, being required to have the COVID vaccine as a condition of employment, many other reasons, and the people who got the vaccine and were injured as well. And so it should be obvious to anyone who is paying attention over the last 5 years or so that what was promised by the people pushing the vaccine has been completely false, has been verifiably, unequivocally shown to be false. These are the public health authorities in the United States, people like Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx, and then politicians, from state to federal level, President Biden, numerous governors of states, senators, representatives, I mean, all down the line, all positions, education, people in positions of power at educational institutions, at hospitals, doctors. I mean, everybody was pushing the vaccine as a panacea. And now, 4 years after the vaccine was rolled out, people have rewritten history, and they're trying to pretend like these grandiose claims that were made about the vaccine, they didn't actually make. And it's astonishing to watch. I know Ness has some thoughts on how to account for this, but just to show the point, I'm going to play a clip of people of authority talking about the COVID vaccine.
Unvaccinated people.
My message to unvaccinated Americans is this.
If you are the unvaccinated, you are the problem.
You're the problem. Condemn them, shame them, blame them. The only people that you can blame are the unvaccinated.
Frankly, we can't trust the unvaccinated.
They should not be part of polite society.
The lunatics who won't take COVID vaccines walking around lawfully unvaccinated? That's psychotic.
If you're willing to walk among us unvaccinated, you are an enemy.
You have no right not to be vaccinated.
You don't have the right to contaminate someone else.
You can't go around pointing a gun in somebody's face, which is what it is when people are unvaccinated.
They are all idiots.
No.
Grow the up and get the vaccine.
Unvaccinated people spread the virus.
It's a vaccine, you dopes!
Don't be Get yourself vaccinated. That's just all there is to it.
There's no excuse.
No excuse for being unvaccinated.
There's no rational and no emotional argument that adds up against getting your damn shot. There just isn't.
But you made a conscious decision not to get the vaccine.
I also have natural immunity. So for me, personally, this vaccine poses a greater risk than a benefit. I'm also not a risk to any of you. Let's look at the science.
So we see that the natural infection is given greater protection or slightly greater protection than vaccination.
This is a vaccine that was created to prevent severity of disease and to prevent hospitalizations. But the vaccine does not prevent you from getting COVID and does not prevent you from transmitting COVID.
Oh my goodness.
Reality.
No,
we have
that's
seen that.
not so. Come on.
No,
you've been at Fox TV
you
too
have
long.
to joy.
I just really don't think that we should allow this kind of misinformation.
Infecting you. The virus stops with every vaccinated person.
Do it so you stop spreading this terrible disease.
And that vaccine, a key goal is to stop the transmission so that you get almost no infection going on whatsoever.
Expectation for vaccines is not to get infected.
A vaccinated person gets exposed to the virus does not infect them.
When the virus gets to you, you stop it.
You're not going to catch it, you're not going to get sick, you're not going to transmit it.
The vaccine is absolutely bulletproof.
Vaccines block you from getting and giving the virus.
100% effective at preventing COVID.
A vaccine prevents you from getting infected.
It is to keep you from getting it and then spreading it.
So there has been very little coverage that I can find of this statement by Deborah Birx. And you would think it'd be big news that, again, one of the top people dealing with the coronavirus pandemic just essentially said that that the vaccine was sold on false pretenses. And if you listen to liberal media, I'm thinking of sources like the New York Times and NPR, you'll see a lot of hand-wringing from the quote-unquote public health establishment that are perplexed and very, very concerned why, for instance, vaccine hesitancy has doubled in the past few years, why people have so much skepticism towards vaccines and public health in general. And the way they present it is like there's just this malevolent force that is floating around, obscuring the truth and misleading people. There's no connection to maybe some of that skepticism is related to the public health response over the past 5 years. There is no true self-reflection, no acknowledgement that doctors and public health officials, people like Anthony Fauci, have some culpability for why people have lost so much trust and why people are not getting vaccinated at the same rates that they were a few years ago. And there's such an arrogance to these people who denigrate anybody, any pleb who does their own research. And the standard excuse nowadays for people who COVIDians who are now maybe realizing that a lot of the things they said were wrong. The standard excuse seems to be that, well, people were scared, it was chaotic, we were all just doing our best, we were acting in good faith, and let's move on. And they're even rewriting history on how the COVID vaccine was sold by people like Fauci, Biden, media figures like Rachel Maddow, even though it was, as we showed, hopefully maybe beat it to death, but showed in that clip the extent of the media coverage and what they were saying. I think it's such an important resource to have, because it's astonishing. It's only been a few years, but you already have people completely trying to rewrite history as if the internet doesn't exist. And these clips can't just be easily accessed, as I found them in a couple minutes of searching on the internet. Now, granted, it was not super easy to find. There's definitely some manipulation on Google's part that makes these kinds of things difficult to find. I even tried to use ChatGPT, and it gave me I was asking about the compilation of misleading statements that public health officials made, and it did acknowledge that there were some misleading statements, but it quickly it acknowledged that, but then it proceeded to lecture me about misinformation and the danger of talking about things like this because it could encourage vaccine hesitancy. And I even asked it, could you direct me to a compilation of public health officials making statements that were shown to be misleading or false, and it refused to do so. It said, we can't find those compilations. And so anyway, but you certainly can find it on the internet. And one more clip I want to play. This is President Joe Biden. This is when he was president, I believe either 2021 or 2022. Here's what he said.
You're okay. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
And so in a minute here, I'm going to ask Ness what he makes of all this, but I want to try to connect it, if there is a connection, I certainly think there is, to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just being nominated to head HHS, as well as Jay Bhattacharya being nominated to head the NIH. I think those are big developments, and I don't think those things would have happened. I don't think those two would have been nominated without COVID. So maybe it's a silver lining. What does it say about our COVID and America in general? So we're going to try to tackle those in a minute. But first, Ness, you heard all that. What are your thoughts?
The same arguments could have been made after the Iraq War and the War on Terror, or the promises about how a multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic society was going to lead us into a better, more harmonious future, or that educational attainment, by providing universal educational attainment, that everyone would become more intelligent. There are all kinds of lies that the managerial class pushes, and COVID is next in a long line of those things. I think the most remarkable thing about the fallout from this relative to instances in the past, and I can most viscerally compare this to the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the War on Terror, and that era of time, because the way that played out and this played out is very similar, and the elites who got behind that, which were virtually all of the managerial class that gave the United States, the Western world, and the entire globe the era of the War on Terror and the messianic push for democratization of the world, which was a euphemistic way of cultural imperialism, Western cultural imperialism, being pushed all across the planet, that the parallels are striking here. And just as those same elites weren't punished very hard, so we see them in the same rehabilitation process now. And so I probably come off as a little jaded, a little cynical. None of this causes me to grasp my pearls as much as I think it does to Jeff, because I've been witnessing this sort of process play out my whole life. I don't feel like this is that much different, other than to bring it back to a theme that we have hit on over and over again. We have an elite insurgency, and the difference now is there is a sliver of the managerial class and potentially a growing number of defectors from the mainline managerial class. This is, again, Elite Theory 101, that are breaking off from the broader managerial class neoliberal establishment consensus. And that is where people like RFK and Elon Musk and, of course, Donald Trump and some of the other big money, big influence actors come into this. And so that is where things are interesting here compared to what has happened previously. But I think it is overly optimistic. I'd be happy to be proven incorrect, but I think it's overly optimistic to think that just because these compilations exist, I mean, these compilations exist about immigration and about the Iraq War and about weapons of mass destruction and about how same-sex marriage wasn't going to lead to all of the other alphabet soup degeneracies. Those compilations are all out there as well. They exist. They can be searched up. They can be found to a certain extent, but not easily. And that has been a change definitely from the early 2000s and the aughts to today, where the censorious nature of the internet has made those sorts of things harder to find now than they were 15, 20 years ago when I was cutting my teeth on red-pilled truths that drove out Pretty Little Lies that I had been taught when I was growing up. And it was easier to find the stuff then than it is now, and yet my frustration is that a vast majority of the public doesn't see these taboos, doesn't search out these truths that are there to be found, these inconvenient truths that are there to be found. They didn't search them out when they were easier to find. And so I am not optimistic that they're going to be searching out montages like the ones that Jeff played here earlier. They are there for that sliver of the population for which truth is a high value, but for most people, it's social conformity that they place a much higher value on, and that is the purpose of what Birx is doing and what other people who are in real time revising history, rewriting history, that is what they're doing. They are effectively trying to grant clemency in personal relationships for people who were strident zealots pushing vaccination and socially shunning people who didn't get vaccinated, and those soldiers who sang the praises of the big pharma medical industrial amalgamation. And so the same people who would have searched out things about the hopelessness of liberal democracy in Afghanistan 20 years ago on account of high consanguinity rates and low IQ and the differential social structure in Central Asia that prioritizes extended family at the expense of individuals and nuclear families on the one hand and nationalism or even internationalism on the other hand. These were all factors that made it obvious that the Afghanistan project was doomed to failure, and yet the elite managerial class pushed it effectively for 2 decades. And almost nobody paid the price for that, and a lot of people became extremely, extremely rich as a consequence of it. And I think the same thing is happening here, and what we get as a consolation prize is to be able to say that we are correct and they were incorrect. But again, if it doesn't result in a fundamental restructuring of the way that the system is set up, then we are simply going to prime ourselves for another instance, another iteration of this to occur in 5 years or 10 years or maybe sooner than that. With, again, the biggest difference now compared to the past is that there are seemingly real oppositional forces among the elites for a variety of reasons that we've discussed previously here. I think the biggest reason being that the unipolar moment really does seem to be over in the Occident. And so in the East, there is a countervailing force that has to be contended with. And so the consequences of pushing forward with lies and then forcing your society to conform to those lies, that is having real world consequences that are so great that they can't be papered over any longer.
While I am more surprised than Ness appears to be, I'm also more white-pilled on the situation for a few reasons. First that comes to mind, we just looked up the most recent polling data on how many Americans right now are fully vaccinated, meaning that they are up to date with all their COVID boosters recommended by the CDC, and it's about 23%. So over 3/4 of people are not getting the vaccine. So they're not following the propaganda anymore, at least in their personal life. Now, whether if enough pressure was put on, if the propaganda machine was revved back up and hysteria was generated, whether those numbers would go right back up to 80, 90+% like they were in 2021, I don't know.
Well, if we look at the flu vaccination, the annual flu vaccination uptake rates, we see that for the exact same point in time for the 2024-2025 flu season, that compliance is at 45%, so about twice what COVID compliance is at this point. And so I view this as a pretty big win for Big Pharma and for the entire neoliberal establishment, the way that they operate. The flu is the most successful continuous income stream that Big Pharma has, and COVID, which was something novel, something that people had never even heard of 6 years ago, as opposed to the flu, influenza, something that goes all the way back to the Oregon Trail games, and prior to that, something that people are intimately familiar with, that something novel was able to, just 5 years later, maintain an income stream that is half what the flu is, which is their biggest income stream, and that they still have immunity and they still own most of, or a significant portion of Congress, and that the social conforming setup is still intact. I think that overall, this is something that will be viewed as a win. Now, if you look at it narrowly in the case of what percentage of Americans are getting their COVID shots now compared to 3 or 4 years ago, yes, there has been progress from our perspective, progress in that their eyes have been opened and fewer people are willingly going along to get the shots, although it must also be said that the social pressure isn't near what it was 3 or 4 years ago to get the shots as it is now. And that pressure could be turned back on, but I don't think it'll be turned back on this specific front. This is the way these things play out over and over again, where the establishment pushes forward 5 steps, and at some point there are negative consequences, and there is a rearguard action, a reactionary action by the public and by an enthusiasm and support for whatever the establishment is pushing goes down. And the establishment pushes forward 5 steps, and there are a couple steps that it gets pushed backwards. I think the same pattern played out in the war on terror. We don't have the United States doesn't have the same military active interventionism now that the country did 20 years ago, but the damage has been done, and there isn't the same level of illegal immigration into the country now that there was 5 years ago. But again, the damage has been done. And so I don't know exactly how it will manifest, but I suspect that if we revisit this in a couple of years, we will see the Western establishment have pivoted to some other front where a bunch of additional damage is going to be done. And a couple years beyond that, there will have been a public pushback against it, and we'll feel like, well, we've gotten back, we've figured out what was wrong, and now everybody can see it, and so now this is the beginning of the end of the direction that we're going in. And meanwhile, the economic and cultural and demographic and health deteriorations will all continue. That's the black-pilled perspective of this grizzled veteran. I'll turn it back over to Jeff now.
Ness, earlier you mentioned the word zealot, and I think that's a very appropriate word to help explain the, from my perspective at least, hysterical reaction from the COVIDians. Just like in Christianity, in the COVIDian cult, there are priests, Dr. Fauci, there is scripture, which is the words of Fauci, there are heretics, who are the people who don't obey the science. There's a dichotomy between pure and impure, the pure people having been vaccinated, the impure people being the anti-vaxxers. You could compare it to people who have been baptized and those who have not been baptized. Christianity is a topic that we've discussed a lot on the reality taboo. I don't want to go into it too much today, but it is interesting. I'll just throw it out there to think, is there any connection, is there any causation between the decline of Christianity and the rise of the COVIDian cult? So would a society like we had 50, 100 years ago, it was much more Christian, would it have reacted significantly differently to the pandemic, specifically on going along with lockdowns and taking the COVID vaccines? There were, of course, I would say most churches who rolled over when they were told they had to lock down and no longer hold services. Suddenly, it's just hard to take seriously church leaders who talk about how important communion is and how essential it is to being a Christian to have the church, because the church actually, the word actually refers to people, not a building. So that communion, that being around fellow Christians was supposed to be an essential part of Christianity and presumably worth dying for. And yet very quickly, pastors and churches across the country closed and obeyed all to the T, every single public health directive.
I think the short answer is no, it wouldn't have played out that way. But Christianity is effectively moribund in America and dead in the rest of the West. This is the replacement religion because that religious impulse is still there, that desire to conform, that desire to be instructed. That hierarchical nature of humanity still exists, and as weak-kneed and feeble as Christians were, of course, the I effing love science crowd, the self-styled atheists and agnostics, were far more willing to roll over and more strident in their persecution of those who refused to do exactly as they were told to do. To the extent that there wasn't any pushback, it was the Orthodox, and it was Christian conservatives and conservatives of other religious denominations that defied the COVIDian orders. It was not the mainline denominations. It was the low-status churches with pastors that would never be permitted to preach in an Episcopalian church.
We here at The Reality Taboo are going to be watching closely RFK's tenure heading the Department of Health and Human Services. And there was an editorial this week from the Wall Street Journal. They were, of course, they've been huge skeptics, enemies, hostile to RFK Jr. So they wrote this editorial in an alarmist negative perspective. I see it as a positive, but I'm going to read from this recent Wall Street Journal editorial. News reports this week say that RFK is preparing to sack members of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. This is the group that decides whether and how to recommend vaccines for the public. Its recommendations help determine which vaccines are covered under the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And so if you recall from last week, one of Elizabeth Warren, who's supposed to be representing the economically vulnerable people in the country, but she's also very, very concerned, or I should say the reality is she's actually concerned about Big Pharma. And she talked about how much harm RFK would do, specifically because if we were to allow people who are injured from vaccines to sue pharmaceutical companies, that could discourage new vaccines from being developed. And so this is kind of on that same topic. RFK is, if he is able to push this through, the bottom line is it would make it easier to sue vaccine makers for vaccines that cause injury, I would assume under a product liability legal theory. So we will continue to watch how RFK does. And then lastly, on the topic of COVID, another white pill for me anyway, this week, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to prohibit federal funding for COVID-19 vaccine mandates in schools. And the order bars federal funds from being used to support or subsidize an educational services agency, state education agency, etc., or institution of higher education that requires students to have received a COVID-19 vaccination to attend in-person education programs. So given how utterly dependent schools of all levels across the country are on federal government funding, if the Trump administration is indeed able to implement that to essentially where if there are any sort of COVID-19 vaccine requirements at an institution, that the money spigot will be turned off, that could make a huge difference in at least getting rid of these vaccine requirements. And I think that's especially important because most of the people attending universities are young people. They are the ones who have the least need for the COVID-19 vaccine. And whenever I talk about Trump and COVID, it's a very interesting conversation because, of course, he was president during COVID, and he doesn't anymore. I haven't actually seen him mention it, but he, as we've talked about before, during the interregnum from 2021 to 2025, he multiple times talked about how proud and tried to take credit for Operation Warp Speed. And so I don't know where he is on the vaccines. It would actually be interesting to hear an interview with him on where he stands on the vaccine, if he has any sort of regrets, if he's changed his mind on the effectiveness of the vaccine, whether if somebody asked him, a young person asked him, should they get the COVID vaccine, what would he say? That would be interesting to hear.
Well, I wouldn't recommend any friendlies asking him that because it would damage his ego. It is not a common character trait for Trump to admit that he was incorrect about something. And so to allow him to make that change in his heart without drawing attention to it is probably the best thing from the anti-COVIDian perspective. While it might be interesting to see him articulate his self-reflection, I don't think it would be tactically prudent to bring that up. And so I hope that nobody does in a public, highly salient setting.
Next, briefly, we're going to follow up on something we talked about a few episodes ago. This is from the Wall Street Journal, titled, Justice Department Moves to Drop Eric Adams' Case After Wave of Resignations. The Justice Department asked a judge Friday to dismiss the bribery case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams, following a standoff between career prosecutors and top Trump appointees that prompted a wave of resignation and exposed deep divisions over the department's pursuit of politically sensitive cases. So the prosecutors, several of the top prosecutors at the Southern District of New York, which is the U.S. Attorney's Office handling the prosecution of Eric Adams, several of them resigned and very flamboyantly left indignant and self-righteous resignation letters talking about how this was completely inappropriate. It was an attack on the rule of law, blah, blah, blah. The prosecution procedurally has filed a motion attempting to dismiss the case without prejudice. And that without prejudice line is very important because what without prejudice means is that the case can be rebrought. If a case is dismissed with prejudice, that means the charges cannot be brought again in the future. And so this ties into what we were talking about last week with the sword of Damocles hanging over Eric Adams. Again, at any time, these charges could be brought again. And now they're just waiting on the judge to rule on the motion, because ultimately the judge has to decide whether or not to grant a motion made by either side. But it's very unusual, if not unprecedented, for a judge to deny a motion to dismiss filed by the prosecution in a criminal case. And so we'll continue to watch. It'll be interesting to see how Eric Adams navigates very, very tricky situation. He's got the Trump administration, like we said, hanging the sword of Damocles over him. But then on the other side, he has his fellow Democrats who are not happy with the situation either. And it looks like Governor Hochul, governor of New York State, will not be removing Eric Adams, which she does have the authority to do under New York law. She can remove the mayor of New York City. But she also said she's going to try to seek to assert more control over the affairs of New York City. And this also potentially, speaking of COVID, somebody who became very well known and infamous during the COVID era was Andrew Cuomo. His horrible handling of COVID, of course, was not the reason why he was forced to resign. It was some questionable sexual harassment charges. Those were what ultimately brought him down. But perhaps this Eric Adams situation lays the groundwork for Andrew Cuomo to make a comeback. There is chatter about Andrew Cuomo throwing his hat in the ring for the New York City Democratic primary, which is due to take place this summer. So stay tuned on that one.
The reason he had to resign wasn't because of sexual harassment. That was the pretense. The reason he had to resign is something I don't pretend that I know exactly, but it was because he lost support from the managerial state for whatever reason or whatever set of reasons. And now, if he is able to return triumphantly and vanquish Eric Adams, I think that could be an indication that he is, well, it would be an obvious indication that he's back in the good graces of the managerial state. And so I think that the upcoming mayoral election in New York City this winter will be a microcosm of the elite theory battle that's taking place, with Eric Adams being a stand-in for the elite insurgency and Andrew Cuomo being a stand-in for the deep state as it exists. Looking now briefly at polling of Democratic primary voters in New York City, I see that Andrew Cuomo is far and away the front runner for the Democratic nomination. Cuomo is at 33%. Eric Adams is in second place at 10%, or actually undecided is in second place at 25%. But Cuomo is beating even the undecideds, and the undecideds plus Eric Adams are equal to where Andrew Cuomo is right now. And Cuomo was, of course, seemingly forced to resign from the governor of the state of New York, and it looked as if he had been discarded and that his political career was over. For whatever reason, the establishment turned on him. They didn't turn on him for sending hundreds or thousands of nursing home patients to their deaths, but they did turn on him over some tawdry accusations about sexual impropriety, sexual misconduct, which is that's a story that is a dime a dozen for political operatives in the Western world. And yet, for whatever reason, they turned on him for that, but they didn't turn on him earlier when they could have disposed of him if they wanted to. And if the corporate media and the political establishment in the Democratic Party had stood behind him when those sexual impropriety accusations came out, it's my opinion that he would have easily weathered that storm and remained as governor of New York. But for whatever reason, they turned on him then to dispose of him. And now I suspect that they are going to welcome him back because he was a good soldier who did not turn on them, did not spill the beans, did not make an enemy out of the establishment. And now, and again, I understand that I'm being conjectural here, that there's a lot of speculation, and the phrase I like to use over and over again is that I'm seeing things through a glass darkly, and I can't understand exactly why they made the decisions that they did. But for whatever reason, over the last 12 or 18 months, he has been rehabilitated such that it now looks like he is the front runner for the mayoral position in New York City. My read is that he had become too big for his britches, that he was potentially looking to challenge Joe Biden for the 2024 presidential nomination, to potentially be the Democratic presidential nominee in 2024. And for whatever reasons, that was not viewed favorably by the establishment. And so he was taken out. And we just looked at some polling from 2021. He resigned as governor in August, and we were looking in March of 2021 when the allegations began being amplified in the media and among Democratic operatives against him, and we saw his polling drop dramatically in that month. And just even in a 3-day period, we looked at March 15th, and support for him was 50% saying he should not resign to 35% saying that he should resign. And then 3 days later, another poll was released showing that 43% thought he should resign to just 40% that he should not resign. The managerial state had turned on him and disposed of him. And now that they have a new enemy that they need to take out, they will call him back up from the Farm League to get back in. And so I think we will see, as I mentioned earlier, a proxy battle, elite battle play out this year in the Democratic primary and then the general election. And it can probably be sussed out by my comments that I don't have a lot of faith, or this is an illustration of why I don't have a lot of faith in the democratic process, because we see from the polling that voters were led by the amplification of these sexual harassment complaints to turn on Cuomo back in 2021. And yet, despite him almost refusing to be contrite about it, doing the "I apologize that my actions were misinterpreted" sort of thing, and not at all showing any real contrition or any real desire to mend his ways by admitting fault for past wrongdoings, that now he is, at least according to these early polls, garnering majority, or at least a strong plurality of support among Democratic primary voters, shows that because he has been rehabilitated in the media for reasons that are not exactly clear, what specifically was it that made him be Me Tooable 4 years ago that now makes him a person who should lead the most important city in the country. It's hard to come up with any little d democratic reasons that reflect well on the process of democracy as a way to choose leaders.
We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk with you next time.